All right, I guess we can start. Cool, thanks for coming everybody. Today we're gonna be talking about AWS Glue. It's an ETL service that Amazon has. It can pretty much load data from basically anything to most common targets. So you can use it on Snowflake, Databricks, Redshift, and yeah, we're gonna get into some of the mechanics, how to get started, and do a quick little demo. So a little bit of background. I'm not going to read that whole thing, but I'm Stephen Lowry, Principal Data Architect for EPON US. I do a lot of data migrations to the cloud, specifically Snowflake, Amazon, Azure. Work with relational DBs, some non-relational stuff, and a lot of Python code because it ends up being a little bit more bespoke most of the time. Been with EPON for 3 years now, and yeah, it's a good time. So, to go over what we're actually going to talk about, Glue is a fully managed ETL service. What that means is you don't have to worry about deploying any infrastructure, you don't have to worry about managing resources, and it can work, again, as I said, on pretty much any data source and load to any data target. Some of the key features we're going to talk about are serverless Spark compute. Again, that means you don't have to host your own Spark clusters, which if you've done before is kind of a pain. It generates code for ETLs automatically. We'll talk about that a little bit with a quick demo of Glue Studio, where you can do a visual interface. It supports semi-structured data, so not just CSV, JSON, and Parquet, but also log files for most common Apache software and some Amazon CloudWatch logs. And it comes with its own orchestration engine baked in, so you don't have to worry about external orchestration. But if you want, you can respond to events and load your data in real time. Yeah, and there's going to be a demo. And then last, we're going to have a Q&A session, so you guys can talk best practices and strategies. And yeah, this is advertising the talk that you're at. Cool. So just to make sure we're all working with the same common context, when we talk about data, usually it's coming from a relational data store. So that's going to be a database. Like PostgreSQL is probably the most popular. MySQL, SQL Server is super popular, especially if you're on-prem, right? And databases are mostly organized in schemas, which are essentially folders for your different tables. Unless you're Postgres, in which case you don't have this layer and things are a little messier. And inside a table, you've got rows and columns. So an individual record within a relational system is typically represented as a single row of data. And with those columns, within the row, there's a number of columns that have a name, a type, and other metadata about them. And together, this is also, confusingly enough, referred to as the schema of your data. So it's both an organizational layer in the database and also a description of the data within a table. Super fun. The reason why that's important, and I just want to make sure we have that context, is when you're moving data from one system to another, all the implementations are going to be slightly different in how they represent that data. One of the most common fun data types that we talk about are dates. They're represented in different ways in different systems. They have time zones. Sometimes their time zones are encoded. Sometimes they are not, right? So the actual implementation and the functions and the ways you work with this data could change across databases. One of the cool things about Glue is that it can pretty intelligently inspect your data and infer those types and the appropriate type for your target system. Yeah, so next, just generally talking about how data typically comes into being. For the most part, let's say your company has a website where customers can purchase something, or an application, or even an internal app, right? Usually there's a computer somewhere that has a bunch of workers on it that are serving up your website. Anytime you want to remember something, like say you make a post to Facebook, that text gets saved somewhere, so if that computer restarts, they can get the data back. That's almost always in an application database. They're typically optimized for lots and lots of things happening, lots of transactions, right? It's a really great way to, say, record a user's information. They are not great for answering a question like, how many daily active users do I have? There's also operational workload, right? So every day, this database is responsible for keeping these workers happy. If you want to answer a big reporting question, you might need to crunch a lot of data. and put a lot of strain on this database, which can result in your app going down, which makes your customers unhappy. So database land has created the data warehouse to keep a separate layer that's more optimized towards answering bigger business questions, doing larger scale compute, and generally just more optimized to handle data from different stores. Part of that process, though, is not just moving the data from one system to another, but also layering in data from multiple systems, right? Data can come from your applications internally. They can come from external third parties, like Google Analytics is almost always one of our data streams. Getting data from third-party APIs, right? You might need to query and get some information that comes in all these different formats, and you need to synchronize your view of a different model, say like a user, right, across these different systems. So typically we use a medallion structure for that, where in the bronze layer or raw layer, we just persist data as is moved into the cloud or whatever our data warehouse is going to be. Then we do some combinations into the normalized layer, and then we try to answer any questions we know we need to answer routinely in the reporting layer, and then we draw pretty charts with some visualization tool. That's usually where the engineering job ends and the analytics begin. Cool. So what does Glue do for that? And well, what Glue does is it gives you an easy way to run Apache Spark, because that's really what it's doing under the covers. So Spark is an open source compute framework. It's got implementations in a bunch of common languages that all of your data friends are going to know. So it comes in Java, of course, Python, SQL, Scala, and even R, which is, I didn't know it did until last week. Yeah, it's a data frame-centric API, so if any of you have used pandas, it is very, very similar. Especially in the data space, you've probably used 5 different flavors of pandas-like interfaces. Spark is yet another one of those. So it's pretty familiar. It also has adapters built in for most of the common data formats. That means you don't have to go and figure out what library you need to load a Parquet file, because it's Arrow, but it's a whole thing to incorporate. So it's got most of the tools you need kind of baked in. And it also separates the definition of what work you want to have done from the actual compute engine, right? So I, as a developer, can write a query that loads in a data frame, does some transformations to it, and puts it somewhere. And I don't have to worry about the compute backend that's actually going to be executing the work, which is great for me as a developer because I don't know how to do that. This does not like me. Aha. OK, so what is Glue? Well, Glue is really just serverless Spark with a few nice things thrown on top to make it a lot more usable. It lets you run these high throughput jobs with a Spark engine that you don't have to worry about, right? It exists when you need it. It goes away when you don't. You're not paying for it in the in-between. It works with almost everything within Amazon, which is good because AWS is a pretty big tent. So there's a lot of things in there. S3 is almost always going to be at least one, if not the major data source. Redshift, of course, is a common target, but also sometimes a source. RDS for your relational databases, your Postgres's that are just sitting in Amazon. DynamoDB, of course, because they love that one. And if you have something more bespoke, you can do a custom JDBC connection to a source or async and emit or source your data from there. It also, one of the things that is a lot cooler than it sounds on the tin is it creates a queryable metadata catalog. What that means in English is it lets you pretend like these are tables in a database without actually doing anything to your data. That's really, really powerful because you can query data that exists in CSV and JSON and Parquet files sitting in an S3 bucket as if it were in an actual SQL database. So you can do initial analytics, or you can have your data scientists go looking for features that they might want to add into their data workflow. You kind of get a data lake for free just on top of S3, which is pretty easy to use. So yeah, these are the different things we're going to talk about. We've got crawlers, which I keep pushing the button.
Stop pressing the off button.
I'm pretty sure that is the off button, yeah. I am not.
Well, blue screen is usually good.
That is good, yeah.
I think blue screen.
Well, if it were bad, it'd be a red screen, right?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean,
Let's see here.
ah,
Hey!
I'm so excited for doing this demo live. It's definitely not going to break. All right, so yeah, let's talk about the different components. Crawlers are what discover new data sources. So when you upload a new file set, you don't have to do anything in the backend API. You can kind of just pick them up automatically through crawlers. There's jobs, which are actually kind of the most of it, but we're going to talk about it the least because it's not particularly visually appealing. It's literally just running Spark. It's code. The data catalog, which I think is the coolest, and then Glue Studio, which is a nice way to get started. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So where does Glue operate within the ecosystem of data? Well, there's different things I like to refer to when I talk about the data ecosystem. There's upstream stuff, which are things that my system guys are going to care about, but I don't necessarily care about, right? They generate the files transfers, the file stores, and all that stuff. This is where I get my data. I do my transformations in my space, and then the analysts do the rest of that. And I also don't look at that. So I'm really working in the middle area here. And this is where Glue kind of does a little bit of everything. Glue handles orchestration for you. It handles transformation for you, ingestion, and the data catalog. It doesn't really do monitoring, but you can kind of do it with CloudWatch. It's OK. But I use this chart for a lot of stuff. So it's there. So with transformation, yeah, you get the Spark engine. For ingestion, you get the Glue crawlers that can automatically discover new data. The data catalog crosses data systems and gives you a unified view of your data. And orchestration is nice because you don't have to host your own orchestration software or run managed workflows for Apache Airflow. You can kind of just use the crawlers as they exist. I'm pushing the right button. Ha.
You will.
OK, so let's talk about crawlers. Crawlers are very basically, you just kind of put a bookmark in an S3 bucket or some sort of file system that Amazon is aware of. And crawlers will essentially just watch the file system if you ever used a file system watch. So if you upload a new CSV file, and it's within a directory the crawler has been instructed to look at, it will attempt to classify that data using a number of classifiers that you have applied to the crawler. We'll talk about classifiers a little bit more in depth on the next page. So you can either run them on a cron schedule or on an event-based. Typically, I think an event-driven architecture can make sense for a lot of use cases, but not most use cases. Most of the time, it's simpler to orchestrate something that runs every day, and that's going to answer most of your questions. If you need to get things on a higher schedule, you can do that every 15 minutes, right? It's pretty straightforward to configure. You can also do them on an event-based. You can either have them run with their own idea of what that means, or you can hook up S3 either directly or through SQS for notifications when a new object is created and feed it in that way. It's really customizable, and you can invoke it from essentially any event source. Classifiers, again, are applied to data, and they should do their best to infer what that data is. That's talking to data types, discovering whether this is a date or a text string, right? So here's an example of a CSV file, right? So this would be comma-separated values, just in plain text. And what Glue's going to do is it's going to say, OK, I see commas. These things up here look like identifiers. So I'm going to guess that these are the column headers. And then, OK, this looks like a numeric field. This looks like a date field in the month, day, year format, right? And it can then infer and map those to actual data types. Yeah, and then once it's figured out what everything is, it writes all that down in the metadata catalog and gives you an interface that you can query as if it were an actual SQL database. Oops. Oh yeah, and it also kicks off jobs to run and transform. So crawlers and classifiers. Classifiers are essentially just a cascading ordered list of different ways to try to interpret data. Most commonly, you're going to say, this is a CSV file, this is a JSON file, or JSON new line, right? Or this is Parquet. And it's just going to infer, if it's an Avro or Parquet, right, there's a schema already there, so it can figure it out. If it's JSON or CSV, it's going to scan the first X number of lines, I think it's like 1,000 right now, of the first file it finds, and then assume the rest of the data for that particular location is the same. So there could be some customization there. And it also can ingest a lot of different log files again, which is really, really handy. If you've parsed logs, it's kind of a pain a lot of the time. You can also make really, really custom classifiers that are specific to your data set. So if you're in control, or if you're not in control of an upstream data set, let's say your replication service is emitting logs and you want to ingest that data into your data lake, you can write your own pattern for the different types of log lines that you could see, classify the data, and then load it automatically into a table within the metadata catalog. Jobs are Spark, stapled to this. So it's really the heart of the thing. Anytime you want to use Glue for transformation, not just ingestion in Athena, which is the query layer, you're going to be working with Glue jobs. They're kicked off by crawlers most typically. The nice thing is you really don't have to know much about how it works in the back end other than it's Spark, it's going to run, it's going to scale, it's going to handle whatever data load you give it. And you can write the job to say, find this, transform this column, join to this table. You can work across any tables in the metadata catalog and access them in a familiar API, typically PySpark, but you can also use the other languages, I guess. I don't know, I'm the Python guy. Yeah, and again, they can be defined in any language. So if you want to say like a pure SQL shop, you can do that. You can use Python as well. And you can emit that data from a job into any type of data store. You can put it into a database, or you can write it to an S3 bucket and keep your data as a data lake. So tables are, again, my favorite part. They're queryable. They essentially look like a table in a database, except they're not. The metadata catalog actually stores the location and the data store that your tables are within. So you're able to access it and find the root file, or pretend that there is no root file, or collect data from across a number of different sources into a single virtual table that exists. You can also run analytics queries. So one thing we're going to do later is we're actually going to group by some values in a CSV file and run SQL against it and actually generate a report. You can automatically create them from crawled files, which is really nice if you have lots and lots of different objects and models coming in. You don't have to individually create tables for each thing. There's no DDL operations. There's no update set, right? It can handle all that for you. Or you can create it manually if you don't like the way the classifier classifies things. You can also, again, apply changes. So if you configure it, you can actually inspect new files. And if a new field appears or if a field's data type changes, say from integer to text, you can handle that automatically and not have to figure out why someone's paging you because everything's shutting down. You can also partition your tables, especially, this is useful, especially if you're trying to do like Internet of Things or something where you're getting sensor data and you have lots and lots and lots of files. You can partition it by date, timestamp, file path within the data store and really optimize your query speeds. And the last Glue thing to talk about is Glue Studio. This is the easiest way to get into Glue or try it out if you just want to see how the thing works or get an idea. We're going to do a little bit of this in a bit. But this lets you define and orchestrate your Glue jobs in a visual interface. So it's essentially a drag and drop. You can say, I want to get data from this source, I want to do these steps of transformation, and I want to put it here when I'm done. And it gives you a nice interface for doing all that. You don't have to worry about deploying code or CI/CD or anything. It just kind of handles it all for you. It's not my favorite way to edit things, but it's definitely a great tool to have in the toolbox. It's also great if you want to explain what steps you're taking. You can actually generate this from your existing jobs and then walk someone through how your data gets made. So it's a nice UI for that. You can also, export it to actual code if you want to keep it in a repo somewhere, which is what I would recommend. It gives you an interface. If you're familiar with Airflow, it's kind of similar to that kind of DAG where you can see like each individual step, what it's dependent on, what it will kick off next. So that's my high-speed overview of Glue. Do we have any questions?
What is your opinion between Glue versus Snowflake?
Glue can be used with Snowflake. It is not a replacement for Snowflake. Glue is for taking data and putting it somewhere or accessing it. You can actually use it in combination with Snowflake. And one of the really cool things you can do is use it with Snowpark. But essentially, you can leverage Glue's metadata catalog to have like a raw or a staging area, create a storage integration to your AWS account so that you can then access it from Snowflake. And then you can just create one big stage over whatever bucket or thing where your data is going to be in the backend, and then you can query the Glue metadata catalog from Snowflake. And if you use Snowpark, you can actually use pandas. It's not like a thing that looks like pandas. It's actually just pandas, which I can't say enough is a relief for me because I didn't like learning pandas the first time. And I get really tired of learning almost pandas. And there's like 17 of those in the ecosystem. So yeah, it's a classic example of Snowflake doing everything right, but very slowly. But yeah, they are not tools that exist in competition. I think Snowflake and Amazon are really good partners. And if I get to set up my own data platform, then I'm probably doing Snowflake on Amazon, right? So yeah.
Is it common to introduce data quality steps into Glue?
Oh, did you hear me talking about this earlier? Okay. Okay. There is a new feature in Glue called data quality. It's not exactly something I would use in most cases because essentially you can say alert, send me an alert if this average on this column goes below a certain percent or above a certain percent, right? It's a pretty standard type of data quality check. Most commonly, I would implement that myself because if I want it to short circuit the pipeline, I want to short circuit it and then like send a message on Slack and like get somebody to put out the fire, right? Or I want it to be informative in like a dashboard, but it's really rare that I want my cloud infrastructure to worry about data quality, right? Like if it's an operational thing, I want it to be in my orchestration, and I don't know. It's there, it's available, and it's definitely something you can drop in, especially if you're using Glue Studio. It's like 2 seconds to drop in a couple of data quality checks and just have them there. But it's not like automatic or like machine learning or anything crazy like that. It's just you manually define some metrics and business logic, and it kind of sits there and will put up a flag if something happens. Yes?
Have you played around with that one Glue ML product that does, what's it called, matching or duplicate values? I know there's some Glue.
Deduping?
Again?
Is it deduping?
Yeah, it does deduplication. It does.
Yeah, that's so in the studio. I know there's some kind of like common transformation steps, and that is one of them, right? There's like attempt to dedupe across a certain thing, but is that?
Yeah, this one's more of a separate, it's like a separate Glue type of job. You actually have to do like a little manifest that goes through and then looks for records that may be the same, and you can kind of like merge.
Interesting.
It's called, but it's some kind of Glue
Yeah.
transformation.
That's another one of the things where I probably would roll my own. Not to say that I don't trust the service.
Very expensive to run.
Yeah, and honestly, one opinion that I have that we'll see where it goes, but I would love to just have a row hash available all the time so I can just run these kind of comparisons really quickly. It's just annoying to do, and there's trade-offs, right? Like you have to either generate it on the fly, which is expensive, or trust that someone else did it right, which can burn you. But it's data, so there's always trade-offs. But I have not used that particular service on Glue now. But yeah, it's like the data quality where it's like, it's there, you can use it, but I don't know if it's one of the premier things. The nice thing is you can run Spark without running Spark. That's really the win.
How long does it take to spin out a container for the processing?
Pretty quick.
It just spins up right away?
Oh, yeah, right. So the question is, how long does it take to spin up a job instance? Ballpark, like a minute. Yeah, it's not one of the super fast services like Lambda where it just works. It's not MWAA where you wait 20 minutes after you hit deploy, right? It's in the sweet spot where you can run something, test it, and then get some information back. But it's not also going to cost you an arm and a leg for that availability.
I wonder if that's going to be an issue. Probably not. Most of the time, whenever you're doing ETL stuff, it's like, it's not real time.
Yeah, especially when you're trying to answer business questions, right? When you're talking about real time, it's almost always operational, right? Like, we need to react to this thing that's happening right now. No one's looking at a dashboard and, well, I won't say no one. Most people aren't looking at a dashboard and like, man, I really wish this had the last 5 minutes of data in this bar chart of 1 million people, right? Like it's, yes, there is some value, but near real time is near good enough and a lot easier to do. So 1 minute's not a big deal, usually, in data land. One of the weird things about data land, 1 minute of latency, eh. Yes.
He was mentioning kind of real time,
Mhm.
or a lot of times that's not the case. But how does Glue handle like streaming jobs, or what compatibility with other services?
That's a good question. I have not had streaming data in Glue yet. Closest I would say is dumping batches into S3, but
We've done that with Spring Batch where
Mhm.
we're actually like, ingesting SQL stream, not like Kafka stream. in
Right.
real time, and then doing some ETL stuff on it.
Yeah.
Like, and then like,
I would
Well,
assume,
with this thing, since the container might not be up at that time, and it takes, I mean, it should still be possible though.
I would assume you'd hook it up through Kinesis.
Yeah, and then like
I mean-
it stands up and does the processing. Right? Yeah,
Yeah.
that should still be that.
Yeah,
That'll still work.
yes.
When should we decide, like, when should we use AWS Lambda
Mhm.
or AWS Glue to do the ETL transformation?
Yeah, so the question, the question is, when should we use Glue versus Lambda for data transformations? I would say you should probably use Glue unless it's super, super lightweight or super, super weird. And what I mean by that is maybe you have like a database that's not a standard database and has a strange connector, right? It's going to be kind of a pain in Glue to install the connector, and that you can do it, don't mind you, but you have to like find the jar, make sure it runs in the Spark runtime. It's going to be difficult to test, and it's going to be a pain. Whereas in Lambda, you can just be like, here's my image, go, and it'll just kind of work. But most of the time, Glue is going to have more tools available to you where you can just kind of let it run, and it will work. You don't really have to worry about, like, I need to install these libraries. Like, I don't know. If one of my most common issues with Lambda is I need like 2 libraries, and now I have to go and make a Lambda layer, which means I need a Python, an Oz Lambda Linux environment to build it in, because not every library builds the right way. I can't just build it on my MacBook. I actually have a Lambda function in our EPON AWS account where you upload our requirements.txt and it builds the layer for you, because it's such a pain. And I'm tired of deploying tiny T2 boxes on Amazon accounts and forgetting about them and costing people $5 a month to build Lambda. So I would say if you can do it with Glue, you should. It just has the tools baked in. It's like, yeah, you might be able to shave a little bit of cost with Lambda, but it's going to be rare that that actually mounts. It's going to be rare that your time is worth less than the amount of time or amount of money you'd save with Lambda, I would say.
So what's your go-to language to write a Glue job and why?
Python.
He's been saying
Because
Is my format.
if your question is the question is what's my go-to language for Glue, and it's Python. My answer for what's my go-to language blank is going to be Python. No, I learned CS on Java. I messed with Python one weekend in college, and I have never started another Java project again. That's just me. It's just one of those things where, like, I know I can do it in my language, and I know someone else has done it in this language. And it might not be the premier language for anything, but it's usually second or third best. So you can pretty much do whatever you want in Python. And PySpark is Python. It's a little different. There's some things it does that I really don't like it throws a bunch of stuff in like the import namespace, which is really weird. And depending on your vendor for Spark, you might get different packages. So like if you use Databricks, they import a bunch of stuff, and it's just kind of there in the background in your notebooks. And for me, I'm pretty familiar with like the built-ins in Python, so like I know what's in the namespace, and sometimes I'll overwrite stuff that I shouldn't, and it shows up later. And all I'd say though, I think Python has seen such rapid growth and is just the language of people that are jumping into data, and data as a field has really come a long way recently. So there's a lot of people that are moving into data, and how do I get into this the easiest way? They learn Python. So it's almost universally accepted. And even if someone's not happy about it, they probably know how to do it, because it's basically pseudocode. It's my favorite language, basically pseudocode. But yeah.
Data is life.
Yeah, man.
The other question, this is kind of new to me, so what's the difference between DMS versus Glue?
That's a great question. DMS, that is a... Thank you for that question as well. The question is, what is that question? Thank you. No. The question is, what's the difference between Glue and DMS? DMS is for copying data. Glue is for moving data. That is the simplest way to put it. And what I mean by that is Glue takes information and it makes sure that it can exist in another form. DMS sees this exists, and I'm going to make sure it also exists here, with no changes in between. It's a replicate, right. It's not an ETL tool, it's ingestion, pure ingestion, which is good because you often need that in the data world. It's also my least favorite part of the data world because there's really no great data ingestion tool that just kind of works. There's vendors, there's Debezium, which I love as a library, but also can't manage to keep running even in my dev environment, so God forbid trying to load that into production. It's a pain point for data, but yeah, that's what DMS does, and it does a fairly reasonable job. Yes?
You showed a Confluence icon next to metadata. Like, what do you do around that? And can you repeat the question?
You guys are keeping me responsible. I don't know if I signed it. Yeah, so the question was, I showed Confluence on the data catalog chart, which I am flipping to now very smoothly. Here. The answer is, it's kind of a place to document things. I don't like it. Well, if you let me set up the documentation, it's going to be either Sphinx or a bunch of markdown files, right? Which has varying degrees of success with people. If you want something that you can easily communicate with people who don't want to make a commit in a pull request, then you might start using Confluence for your data dictionary or like your communication layer where you actually write paragraphs of text that describe the things that are going on. So that's what I was thinking. Again, I use this chart for like everything, so it's kind of generic. So.
Yeah, I haven't seen it get implemented perfectly, which is why I was curious.
You know, I think documentation exists in a weird place because there's low-level technical documentation, right? Like this is what this function does and this is why it does it. There's also the high-level documentation that explains why we do things the way we do, and this is kind of why we think. But mixing the two together never really works well. Confluence is definitely that high level. I think the worst form of documentation is just having files on a drive on the network somewhere, right? Like data lake documentation version 1 final draft, right? That's the worst you can do. The second worst is maybe Google Drive. And Confluence isn't on the bottom of that list. I don't think it's something I'm ever excited to jump into, but there is definitely a role for it and tools like it in explaining what we do. Because yeah, everyone should have a general idea of how the data works. It's really important for the business to keep operating almost always, or people wouldn't pay us, right? So yeah, it plays a role. It's not something that I use like automatically or programmatically though. I mostly use like the wiki style thing. Mm-hmm.
Who here loves documentation, receiving it? Who here loves documentation?
Who loves writing a long list of documentation and then having people ask you to read it to them? If it doesn't bother you a little bit, right? Are you doing it right? Cool. Any other questions, or do you want to try to make a demo work?
Demo.
And this is definitely going to pay off. You guys are going to be so glad I did this. Look at that. I have demo here. All right. So what I did here for our demo, we're going to be using my VS Code window, which is all prepped and ready. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate some CSV data. I'm going to upload it to S3. I'm going to make a crawler, go discover that data, and then render it in Athena. Then we're going to write a SQL query where we do a simple group by to demonstrate that, yes, you can in fact write SQL to access this data that existed as a CSV file. So that's a pretty good example of almost always what you're going to do first in Glue. And the next thing we're going to do is use Glue Studio to do some basic transformations, which is probably the second thing you're going to do in Glue. So just to give you an overview, we can write it. We can try writing a job, but it's just going to run. Like, it's not very thematic because it just goes beep, done. But we can. Anyways, I've made this library here with the CLI, which is definitely not necessary, but I like doing it. So here's the data we're going to generate. I used GitHub Copilot just to spit out some random credit card looking stuff. Yeah, Copilot's cool. So let's go ahead. Oh yeah, watch the. You want to see it? It's kind of cool.
Lane's like, is that my credit card number?
Always do a doc string. It's $10 a month, man. I'm telling you, it's worth it. Pick it up. Let's see.
Sub-demo. That's pretty.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I didn't do this, by the way. I'm just showing off someone else's work.
Are you not typing in? What do you think? Who's doing that?
But yeah, it's cool, right?
Who's doing it?
Like,
We're gonna be out of job.
I've been doing. All right. Oh yeah. I mean, I wrote this all myself. It's very impressive. No, so that's where it came from. So we're gonna write this to temp/demo data because I'm creative and I haven't named it that already. Let's do 25. No, let's do 500 rows. Why not? All right. So in our temporary directory, we have this lovely demo data file. Got our headers. We got. Yeah, and this is raw data, my friends. We have it. So let's go ahead and put it in S3. So,
No, you need to use CLI Glue.
Oh, I know what
I was going to, but for the sake of the demo, I am using the Oz console and not my custom CLI that runs Amazon CLI commands because that would probably not be user-friendly. Cool, so we're going to put it in this data. One thing I recommend, anytime you're in S3, just make a top-level key called data if you're going to upload data, because you're going to have some metadata that's going to come up, and it's a pain to like try to filter it. There's also like some rules. You can't put events on like keys and subkeys that collide, so like just a random glue or a random S3 tip. I always do that. So over here in our data key, the credit cards, CSV, let's upload our file, and it should already have it right here. So we're going to upload it. This is going to be there along with some of the other data I did today. And since it's a tiny file, it's already there. And because I already ran this once today, I'm going to copy that address. So now let's go to Glue. In this tab, we're going to hop into AWS Glue. We're going to go to crawlers, and we're going to make a new one. Let's call it epon glue demo 4, because I haven't done this 4 times. We're not going to say it's mapped to a Glue table, so we get a new one. We're going to add a new data source. We're going to say that it's in that S3 key. Oh, look how clever that was. I copied it earlier. Wonderful. So it's going to go in there. It's going to crawl all subfolders. It's almost always what you want. But if you do want to set up different crawlers, say you want to do a different set of classifiers, that's when you would not enable that option. You can also tell it to grab new data instead of existing data. That's helpful if you want to like test a new feed or something. But almost always this is what you're going to do. Is just say, yeah, this data is in S3, and I want you to start doing stuff with it. So you can go. You can create it. One of the things I love that more Amazon services need is you can just create a role for it, and it just does the permissions for you. So you can say like glue demo 4, and it creates the IAM role for you, if you have permission to, of course, and it puts it there, and you don't have to remember like the weird S3 syntax for like this, I want this bucket, and I can list that bucket, and I can also see things in the bucket. It's a whole thing. So we're going to put this in the Glue demo database. We're going to prefix it with demo 4, so we know for sure that it's this one, and we're going to run it on demand. Here's where I'm talking about where you can just kind of use the built-in orchestration. It works for simple pipelines, and if you have an orchestration service, you probably still want to, like if you're running Airflow, for example, and you want that to be like the responsible layer for your data, then you leave it on demand. If you just want to run it hourly, though, and it doesn't matter, just leave it on hourly, right? But it gives you some really easy options here. Run it on demand, and review, and create our crawler. All right, so there it is. I'm going to go ahead and delete those other files in the bucket so we can just see the data we put, because I should have done that earlier. These two. We're going to remember, I still don't know how to spell the word permanently off the top of my head, and Amazon reminds me of that all the time. All right, so we just have our CSV file in the target, and we're going to go ahead and run our crawler. This is CSV data, so it's going to know. I think that's the default. But if we wanted to make it a little more custom while we wait, because it's going to take a minute, this is where you assign classifiers. I'll walk you through the interface over here real quick. So I don't know why it defaults to Grok. It should default to CSV or JSON, but that's just like a stylistic choice on their part. These are the default interpreter types for data. So you can say like, oh, this is JSON, and within that JSON, I want to get like foo.bar or like user.policy.id, right? You can specify a path that you actually want to extract for a particular model with a classifier. With CSV, it's just delimiter, really, and if you're using a different quote character. The worst delimiter I've seen in CSV, it was like a pipe and then 2 carets for some reason. I almost wrote like a Lambda function to take the data and fix that and replace it with a comma. But like I felt for the person who generated that one day, because clearly that was the first time they ran into the problem of escape characters. And hey, they solved it, kind of. So yeah, you can just specify things if you need to get into it. XML, I'm sorry if you have to deal with XML. Grok is Amazon's kind of custom language for interpreting data paths. It uses a really weird syntax, but this is the one you want to use if you have like log files, where you can specify exactly where the data is. You can also use it with fixed files if you have those, and I also feel for you if you're dealing with those. But yeah, that's classifiers in a nutshell.
This is the reading part, right? You classifying
Yeah.
read, not the write, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the write just goes in whatever format you tell it to.
Are you transforming before you
I will show you a transformation, but not here. This is just the ingestion into the metadata catalog, which really is just writing down where it is and what it is, right? So hopefully our run is done. Let's check. It is not.
It's crawling.
It's not a runner. It's a crawler.
That was fair.
I didn't even think of that one ahead of time. Yeah, we can flip through some random settings while we're here. Nope, I don't like those. Oh, hey, look, it finished.
Yeah, it's great.
41 seconds. All right. So we got a table change. We added a table called demo for CSV. We discovered a table. We added it in. Okay, so let's go look at it. So inside our Glue demo database, we have 4 tables. We have this one called demo for CSV. And you'll see here, we identified different types. And we can see it didn't notice that the date type is a date. One of the wonderful things about inspection.
Card expiry.
Yeah.
That should be a date.
You would think.
How, I don't know.
And you can make it do that. Just it's one of those things where like I'm surprised when it works rather than surprised when it breaks. Because like you think dates are bad enough in the U.S., but like you think about international dates and.
I pity the fool who had to write that date binary, like, you know.
So I learned a couple of years ago. How many time zones do you think there are? Like 12? It's 200.
Oh, like the different time zone?
Oh,
There's like
th-
200.
some countries are like, you know what, we're going to be 5 minutes off just because. It's ridiculous. So yeah, dates are fraught, and that's just a thing that we have to deal with in the data world. Cool, so we can actually look at this data, and this is going to ask me if we can go to Athena, and the answer is yes. So Athena is just what they call the SQL interface they lay on top of the metadata catalog. You can see here it wrote this incredibly complex query for us, which is just going to give us 10 rows. And look at that. This is the data that we were talking about earlier. Let's see if it lines up in order. Probably not. 9566. Oh yeah, look at that. 24. Yep, it's probably right.
Yeah.
So there's our data in a SQL-like interface. And to prove that we can do stuff with it, let's do a quick report on how many cards we have by type. So let's select card type counts.
Credit cards with expiry date lesser than today.
Okay.
Is it gonna work?
I don't.
It's a text field though, right? That's what I'm saying. I mean, you would
I'll do that
to-
next.
You
Okay.
would have to cast it.
And I hope me typing lowercase SQL does not irk anyone. But look at that. We ran a report on our data. And it even adds up to 500. So I think. Yes, it does.
No discover.
Yeah. So our data is available. We can already interact with it as if we were a data analyst and we want to write a quick report, right? You don't have to spin up any infrastructure. You just drop your files in S3 and you get a SQL interface, right? That's really nice. It's a hassle-free. So if you need to do something quick or a one-off, right, it's perfect. You can also use it in production systems. It's a perfectly fine interface. But more typically, you're going to put it in a data warehouse where you can play with it at a larger scale. Yes?
So you need to use Glue to use Athena, right? Is that correct?
Yes. The question is, do you need to use Glue to use Athena? And the answer is yes. I think behind the scenes, if you access it directly from S3, it just creates a mini data catalog for Glue in the back end and like puts it in there. But yeah, it's a part of Glue, but it's like a separate interface. There's probably 2 different Amazon teams that work on it, so the whole thing there. But yeah. Yeah, so that's Glue crawlers and classifiers and ingesting data. It's pretty straightforward. Demo curse didn't hit us, so it worked. Yeah. Any other questions about ingesting data with Glue?
Where do you do the transformation? Like suppose if you have like
Yes. That happens over.
What is the question?
The question is, how do you actually do transformations?
Turn the hand next to discover.
Like you want to transform
Yes.
the text field to data field.
Yes, so those are Glue jobs, right? So yeah, there's a bunch of different ones. Let's use the Jupyter notebook so we can have something that looks at least somewhat visual. And let's create a new one from scratch. No, I want 4. Yeah. I don't think I did 3. I just decided I was looking 4. Yeah, this also spins up for a minute because it's serverless, but it should be pretty quick. Yeah. Yeah, it's just going to be a more visual way to see it. If you've ever used Databricks, that's notebooks. Jupyter's notebooks, yeah. It's a console with a text editor stapled to it, basically. Oh, cool, they give us a bunch of stuff to start with. Yeah, this is kind of what I was talking about. Sometimes the vendors will do this behind the scenes, and these names will just be in the namespace, which...
It's literally a Spark job which is being picked up
Yeah.
behind the scenes. It's literally Spark. Right?
Yeah.
And that's
It,
what, okay.
again, that's why I didn't have something for it, because it's like...
It's like serverless Spark. You know?
Yeah. It also does this, which I don't like. It imports star.
Yeah, that's not good.
So I don't know what's in there now, so I might overwrite something I shouldn't. But I also didn't have to contact my sysadmin buddy and be like, hey, can you get me a Spark cluster? Can you keep it up online? And by the way, I'm going to double my workload next week for a couple hours. Is that a problem? And then you don't have to hear the stream of expletives he says back to you when you say that, right? It just kind of works, right? So yeah. I mean, we can run this. I don't know what this one does. It's just an example. Let's change table name to be, database is demo DB, right? I don't know, let's do it live. Database is called Glue demo. And our table is named demo for CSV, which I'm going to copy. All right. And go.
Oh, isn't it loaded or
Uh,
the role seems not, what?
Oh yeah, it's trying to run as me, or it's not trying to run as me, it's trying to run as the role which just has read access to,
S3,
right. So
is it missing write permissions?
I would have to pop into IAM and fix that. Let's think. How much do we care about seeing this give us a green check mark?
We didn't feed it to ChatGPT.
No, I'm not, only because I don't want to share my ChatGPT history. That's a little personal.
Yeah, I don't want to know anything about ChatGPT history.
Look, I already showed you Copilot, and you can't get all my tricks all at once. Yeah, so if you're familiar with pandas, it's basically pandas, but like slightly different. Again, they have their own library in there too, but you can use Boto 3 too if you want to interact with other resources. Typically won't need to do that because they're all available. And yeah, you just say from catalog. It's kind of their shortcut to say, go ahead, read the metadata catalog. You don't have to specify like the weird Spark drivers and things. They have a helper function for you. And then you can play with the data and do all your data frame-based stuff there. And then, yeah, you can just wire this up to your crawler or run it on schedule. It's got the same orchestration option right there. So yeah, that's notebooks. There's also the visual one, which I was going to talk about next. And this one actually is for, but I didn't do this one. So this is an example of Glue Studio, right, where you can actually visually edit the tool. Again, this isn't probably something you want to use for your multi-billion row records that you do heavy transformations on, right? This is something that's for your introduction to Glue. This is for getting into it, getting familiar with the operations you can do, or explaining a workflow to someone else, right? It's not that you can't do it, but you probably want some additional controls in place by the time you roll into production with like CI/CD and security and all that, which you kind of skip with the console, with the visual console, but it's a great way to get started. So here you can see this is just a connection to S3 in a different bucket where we specified, select these guys, right? We've also got a branches table. I think this is Antonio's thing, right? Yeah. Yep. Yep. So this does a left join between the tables. On branch equals branch ID, right? So like you can see it's basically a visual SQL, which is what's going to happen more or less. It's actually writing Spark API calls at the end of the day. But so here's an example where you take sales and we transform them. It's just an aggregation, and then it gets emitted as JSON to an S3 bucket. So this aggregates the status field and counts it. I think status includes the sold option. Yeah, this one, same thing. And then we tried to do the data preview earlier, and it took a while to spin up, so I'm going to kick that off now.
And this is for Snowflake.
Yes.
Glue for ETL, Snowflake, Demo.
Yes. This particular one was developed with Snowflake in mind as the end target, but the method of transmission to Snowflake was actually through a storage integration and a stage, because we're just throwing everything in S3 buckets at the end. Because yeah, that's usually the easiest way to go between Glue and Snowflake is throw it in S3 as a nice structured file, either JSON. Honestly, yeah, JSON's the best one. You can do Parquet too. That's going to give you advantages in read time and write time. The problem with using Parquet for most things is since it's a columnar based, it's harder to batch and it's harder to understand generally what's going on because it's also not human readable. JSON in Snowflake is just easier to parse. You don't have to know how many records you have because for some reason in CSV you can't access the fields by header. Even if there is a header, you have to do $1, $2, $3. You're kind of forced to do a renaming step. With variant data, you can actually use like functions. Snowflake actually has the built-in function to create the DDL to create a table from inspecting a variant object, which is what JSON gets ingested as. So I almost always use JSON with Snowflake, particularly, because it's really easy compared to CSV or any other format, really. Yeah, this is the visual thing. Let's see if it gives us the preview.
How do you compare the studio to for a data analyst, who is not a data engineer?
Mm-hmm.
How do you compare it with Matillion, for example?
With Matillion, I would say Matillion's got a more user-friendly interface. It's designed with the analyst in mind, so it's the tool that's written for them. This is definitely not the premier feature of Glue. However, you also don't have to provision Matillion. You don't have to worry about Matillion servers, instances, right? Because they do kind of have serverless, but it's not as easy as Glue, right? Where you don't even think about the servers, right? It's just an abstract concept for you, right? And the other nice thing about Glue Studio, again, if you want to explain this to, say, your COO, right? Like, I can show you this chart, and you can very quickly understand what process is happening to get to the end result. Whereas with something that's a bit more scripty, I know your eyes are going to glaze over as soon as you see a page that looks like this. I can see it's already affecting him, right? Even though that's my world, this is a nice compromise between the two. And again, you can put jobs in, you can import or export from this interface. So I mostly use it as a GUI tool to demonstrate things that I've already written rather than writing things in here. But I do think most things are a little backwards, so yeah.
So there's no barrier between the data engineer and the data analyst?
There is, it's IAM. Yeah. Yeah, if you were going to hand this to analysts and say, go, I would say make sure that you lock down permissions, just because, I mean, you should lock down permissions on anybody. But you don't want to say, okay, go ahead and write your own data pipelines without having someone reviewing, because everyone's seen the query that's like 5,000 lines long that ends up writing like the same thing copied and pasted 100 times. You don't want that hit and prod. It's just good to have someone come in and check to make sure. But this gives you a really easy way to do it. It's just not going to be the most optimized most of the time, just from the nature of the tool. It's one of those trade-offs with accessibility and optimization, right? Like, the easier you make it to do, the more likely you do something wrong, because there's not as many guardrails up, right? So it's compromised, but as a visualization layer, it's pretty cool. The data preview is not working. That's cool. There are 3 things, and you cannot see them here, but we can look at what they would look like. It would have status and account. Cool. Any questions about demos stuff or?
Question?
Yes.
No, just say one last question.
One last question. Who wants it? Was that the last question?
What's the, do you have any cost, like pricing on Glue?
The question is, do you have pricing on Glue? Yes and no. I can show you the pricing page. Less than $100.
It said it was 100, but that's way too high. I would assume less than $1, maybe.
It says 0
You think it was more than $1? Just running that one thing?
Less than 100 is not incorrect.
Yeah.
That
is correct. That is true.
I'm the data guy. I'm not the cost guy. I can optimize runtime. That's like a Lane problem. That's not a Stephen problem. Yeah. It more or less follows the same model as most of the serverless stuff in Amazon, which is to say it's pretty cheap for the compute. The storage is a little pricier, but you're paying for S3 storage, right? You're not paying for like transmission in and out of the network unless you're pulling stuff in and out of the network, right? We can look at the pricing page. Yeah. Yeah, of course they have their own unit, right? Why not?
It's like they do the same with database, right? They have the write unit, the read capacity.
Yeah,
whatever.
RUs and yeah, it's yeah.
Whatever that is, that's like.
Yeah, it's not going to be the most expensive thing in your ecosystem. It's probably not going to be the cheapest, but it's going to be somewhere in between. I mean,
It's invoiced at the minute.
data processing units. I was about,
Oh, data processing unit has the GPU data.
but you know they only use this with Glue, right? They don't use DPUs for anything else. Cool. Well, thanks, guys.